The sky burns copper over Montana as ash falls like tarnished snow. A man stands alone on his porch, weathered hands clutching a bank notice, the kind that ends family legacies. 3 generations of calluses, sweat, and sacrifice reduced to corporate letterhead. Some fires announce themselves with smoke. Others arrive in business suits, buying water rights upstream. In the distance, flames devour ancient pines that have survived 100 summers. The drought has turned the forest into kindling, waiting for the spark. Nature and commerce, twin horsemen of an apocalypse that's been building for years. They say you can tell everything about a man by what he saves when his world burns down. The cattle, the land, the promise made to a woman 5 years dead. Or perhaps, most telling of all, a stranger trapped in the inferno's path. When the flames finally reach your doorstep, there are only 2 choices: surrender what you love, or stand and fight in the face of impossible odds. Some fires change everything they touch. The morning sky over Pine Ridge hung copper red, an ominous ceiling that filtered sunlight into something alien and threatening. Jack Thornton stood on his porch, coffee mug gripped in a weathered hand, studying that sky with the wariness of a man who'd seen its like before. At 58, the lines etched around his eyes told stories of harsh Montana winters, punishing summer heat, and the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from fighting losing battles year after year. He took a long sip of coffee, grimacing at both its bitterness and the letter he'd left spread open on the kitchen table. Third notice from First Montana Bank. Final warning before foreclosure proceedings. The carefully worded corporate message might as well have been written in neon. Your family legacy ends here. Thornton, 40 years of drought, 40 years of early frosts, 40 years of markets rigged against the small farmer. And now this, a record-breaking dry season threatening what remained of his once thriving cattle operation. Jack had sold off half his herd already, watching them lumber onto transport trucks with a hollowness in his chest that felt like betrayal. His father would have called it surrender. Weather's turning, he muttered to himself, scanning the distant tree line where haze had begun to gather, obscuring the mountains beyond. The drought had transformed Pine Ridge's surrounding forests into perfect kindling, and the lightning storms predicted for the weekend had emergency services on high alert. Jack's phone vibrated in his pocket. His daughter's name appeared on the screen, and despite everything, he smiled. "Hey, Rachel," he answered, voice softening. "Dad, you sound tired." Rachel's concern carried clearly across the connection. 25, and in her 3rd year of medical school, she'd inherited her mother's intuition along with her warm brown eyes. "Just the usual," he deflected. "How's the hospital treating you?" "Brutal hours, but I'm learning a ton." "Dad, I saw the weather report for your area. They're saying critical fire danger." Jack moved back inside, glancing at the bank notice before folding it away. "Nothing we haven't handled before?" "That's not what I'm hearing. The drought's worse than anything in recorded history out there." "Rachel, I've been handling emergencies since before you were born. Remember who taught you to build a fire break?" Her sigh came through clearly. "That was for controlled burns. Dad, not wildfires during the worst drought in 50 years. Jack wanted to reassure her, but the red sky outside made promises difficult. "I'll be careful. Got the emergency bag packed. Truck's always fueled up." "What about the notice from the bank?" Rachel asked quietly. Jack froze. "How did you—" "Mrs. Abernathy's son works there. Small towns. Remember, she called me worried." Jack's jaw tightened. Privacy was another casualty of rural life. "It's nothing I can't handle." "Dad, if you need money—" "Absolutely not," he cut her off. "Your mother and I set aside that money for your education. It's non-negotiable. Mom would want you to keep the ranch." The mention of Sarah created the familiar ache in Jack's chest. 5 years gone to cancer, and sometimes the pain still felt fresh enough to drop him to his knees. "Your mother would want you to become Dr. Rachel Thornton," Jack said firmly. "That was the dream we both had. End of discussion." After promising to call if conditions worsened, Jack ended the call and returned to the porch. The smoke on the horizon had thickened, but it remained distant. Probably that blaze over in Wilson County they'd been reporting on the news. With a last glance at the threatening sky, Jack grabbed his work gloves. Bank notices wouldn't stop fences from needing mending or cattle from requiring water. The day stretched before him like all the others, since Sarah's passing, a solitary marathon of physical labor that left little time for dwelling on what couldn't be changed. In some ways, he preferred it that way. Work was a familiar companion that asked nothing of him but sweat and determination, unlike the memories that ambushed him in quiet moments. Jack headed to the barn, a structure older than he was, but maintained with the same stubborn care he applied to everything on the ranch. Inside tools hung in precise order, each in its designated place. Sarah had teased him about this methodical habit. But organization mattered when resources were limited. You couldn't afford to waste time hunting for what you needed. His ancient Ford F-250 sat waiting. Its blue paint faded to a patchy gray in places, but its engine as reliable as sunrise. Jack ran a hand along its hood in a gesture that was part affection, part superstition. The truck had belonged to his father before him, and like everything else on the Thornton Ranch, it had outlasted its expected lifespan through sheer stubborn maintenance. "Another day, old girl," he murmured, climbing behind the wheel. The ranch spread out before him as he drove 230 acres that had once seemed vast but now felt vulnerable. A shrinking island in a sea of corporate agriculture. To the north, the massive irrigation systems of Horizon Agricultural Corporation's recently acquired properties gleamed in the morning light, a stark contrast to Jack's own cobbled-together water management system. He tried not to look at them as he drove toward his east pasture. No point in feeding the bitterness that had become his unwanted companion these past few years. Elaine Winters adjusted her sunglasses as her rental SUV bounced along the poorly maintained back road. The GPS had confidently announced she'd arrive at her destination 15 minutes ago, but all she'd found was increasingly rugged terrain and a growing sense she'd made a serious miscalculation. "You should have hired a local guide," she muttered to herself, echoing her producer's parting advice. But Elaine had always done her best work alone during the research phase. That solitude was where she found the heart of her stories, the emotional truths that had earned her 3 Emmy Awards and a shelf of other accolades that gathered dust in her Los Angeles office. At 52, Elaine had reached the point in her career where she could choose her projects, and after her last documentary series on climate refugees had swept the festival circuit, expectations for her next work were stratospheric. The pressure had paralyzed her for months until she'd stumbled across a small news item about rural communities battling increasingly catastrophic wildfires with dwindling resources. The story had resonated with her immediately. 20 years ago, a devastating wildfire had destroyed her parents' home in Northern California, taking with it family photos, heirlooms, and the sense of security she'd always taken for granted. Though her parents had survived, something fundamental had shifted in them that day. Her father, once jovial and adventurous, had grown cautious and withdrawn. Her mother had developed anxiety that worsened with each fire season. Their experience had planted the seed for Elaine's career. Her first student film had documented their neighborhood's recovery efforts. Now she wanted to tell a larger story, how climate change was transforming the American landscape and the lives of those who remained to fight for their piece of it. The SUV jolted violently as it hit a particularly deep pothole, and Elaine swore under her breath. The vehicle wasn't designed for this terrain, but the rental company in Missoula hadn't offered many options for her last-minute trip. She'd taken what was available, eager to reach Pine Ridge before the forecasted lightning storms arrived. Through her open window, Elaine caught the acrid scent of smoke, stronger than it had been an hour ago. She glanced at her cell phone, no service, as expected in these remote areas. The sky above had darkened to an unsettling burnt orange, and a faint haze had begun to obscure the road ahead. "Not good," she murmured, slowing the vehicle as she crested a hill. The view beyond stopped her breath. In the valley below, a distant line of trees was clearly ablaze, an orange-red glow visible even in daylight. What disturbed her more was how quickly the flames appeared to be moving. Pushed by winds she could now feel gusting through her window. Elaine pulled over, grabbed her professional camera from the passenger seat, and stepped out to assess the situation. Years of documentary work in crisis zones had taught her to respect natural disasters from a safe distance. Through her telephoto lens, she could see the fire spreading faster than seemed possible, consuming the drought-stricken forest with terrifying efficiency. Time to backtrack, she decided, lowering the camera. As she turned to re-enter her vehicle, a sharp crack echoed through the valley. Elaine watched in horror as a massive pine, its base consumed by flames, toppled across the road behind her, effectively cutting off her retreat. Sparks showered into the dry brush along the roadside, immediately catching and spreading. "No, no, no," Elaine breathed, scrambling back into the SUV. She turned the vehicle around, facing the only direction now available forward, deeper into unfamiliar territory, with a wildfire gaining ground behind her. The GPS remained stubbornly silent, its screen showing her location as a blue dot in a sea of green. No roads visible. Elaine accelerated, trying to put distance between herself and the advancing flames, but the road conditions worsened. The smoke thickened around her, reducing visibility and making each breath increasingly difficult. She rolled up her window and switched the air conditioning to recirculate, buying herself some time. Her mind raced with memories of other wildfires she'd documented the devastating speed, the unpredictable wind shifts, the way flames could leap seemingly impossible gaps. Having witnessed the aftermath of such disasters, she knew precisely what was at stake. Death by fire was not a fate she could contemplate calmly. The SUV bounced violently as she pushed it faster than the rugged road warranted. Each jarring impact sent pain shooting through her wrists and shoulders. But stopping wasn't an option. Through breaks in the smoke, she could see the advancing wall of flame, unnaturally orange against the darkening sky. 5 tense minutes later, disaster struck. As she navigated a sharp bend, an enormous fallen tree blocked the narrow road completely. Elaine slammed on the brakes, the SUV skidding to a stop mere feet from the massive trunk. She reversed, intending to find another route, when the engine sputtered and died. "Not now," she pleaded, turning the key repeatedly. The engine coughed, caught briefly, then failed again. When she checked the temperature gauge, it had spiked into the red. The rough terrain had damaged something vital. Elaine grabbed her emergency go bag, a habit from years of field work in uncertain conditions, and exited the vehicle. The smoke had thickened considerably, stinging her eyes and scratching at her throat despite the bandana she quickly tied over her nose and mouth. The crackling of approaching flames grew louder, punctuated by the explosive sounds of trees succumbing to fire. With her phone useless and the vehicle disabled, Elaine faced the grim reality of her situation. She was trapped, alone, with a wildfire advancing rapidly on her position. Survival now meant finding shelter or a path out on foot. Neither option seemed promising as she scanned the smoke-obscured landscape around her. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but professional instinct kicked in the same calm focus that had served her in war zones and natural disasters across the globe. Assess, plan, act. Emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. Elaine slung her camera and go bag over her shoulder and began moving away from the road, searching for any natural feature that might offer protection: a stream, a rocky outcropping, even a clearing wide enough to provide some buffer from the flames. The terrain sloped upward, increasing her exertion and making each smoke-filled breath more painful than the last. She'd covered perhaps a quarter mile when she realized her mistake. The uphill path had seemed logical, offering a better vantage point, but now she understood she was potentially trapping herself. Fire moved faster uphill, and the ridge she was approaching could become a deadly funnel for heat and flame. Changing direction, Elaine began to work her way across the slope rather than climbing further. The underbrush had thickened, grabbing at her clothing and slowing her progress. Each glance over her shoulder confirmed her worst fears: the fire was gaining ground, its roar now audible even through the pounding of blood in her ears. Then, through the haze, came the distant rumble of an engine. Jack had been checking water levels at the stock pond farthest from the house when he spotted the first definitive signs of trouble. What had been a distant haze on the horizon had transformed into a towering column of smoke, much closer than the Wilson County fire should have been. He'd immediately called the local fire station only to confirm his fears. A new blaze had sparked in the national forest land adjacent to his property, possibly from a lightning strike the previous night that had smoldered undetected until conditions were right. "We're stretched thin, Jack," Fire Chief Bill Mackey had told him. "Got 3 crews already deployed to Wilson County? I can send a truck your way, but it'll be at least an hour." "I'll start prepping the fire breaks," Jack had replied, knowing an hour might be too late if the wind picked up. Now, driving his ancient Ford pickup along the old logging road that marked his property's eastern boundary, Jack assessed the situation with the practiced eye of a former wildland firefighter. The blaze was advancing faster than expected, feeding on bone-dry vegetation after 3 years of drought. His weather-beaten face set in grim lines as he calculated risk against time. Memories from his firefighting days surfaced unbidden, the Carson Valley disaster, where he'd lost so many colleagues. The nightmares that still woke him, sweating and gasping for air, 2 decades later. Jack pushed the thoughts away. This wasn't then. He knew what he was facing, and he knew what needed to be done. The truck's radio crackled with emergency broadcasts, evacuation orders for communities to the north, road closures, warnings for ranchers to move livestock away from the fire's projected path. Jack listened with half an ear, more focused on the visual indicators around him. The wind direction, the color and density of the smoke, the behavior of wildlife fleeing ahead of the flames all told him more than any official report could. He just decided to turn back toward the ranch house when movement caught his eye, a figure emerging from the smoke ahead, waving frantically. Jack accelerated, recognition dawning as he drew closer. Someone was trapped on the logging road, and from the unfamiliar SUV visible through the smoke, it wasn't a local. Jack pulled up alongside the woman, taking in her soot-smeared face and the professional camera hanging around her neck. City folk, his mind categorized immediately, noting her expensive hiking boots and the quality of her outdoor gear. "Get in!" he shouted above the roar of approaching fire, pushing open the passenger door. "This whole area is about to be overrun." Elaine didn't hesitate, throwing her bag into the truck bed and climbing in beside him. "My car broke down," she explained breathlessly. "I tried to outrun the fire, but—" "Logging road's no place for a vehicle like that," Jack interrupted, executing a rapid 3-point turn. "You're lucky I was checking the boundary line." As if to emphasize his point, a massive pine crashed across the road where her SUV sat, showering the vehicle with burning debris. Elaine flinched at the near miss as Jack accelerated away from the fallen tree. "I'm Elaine," she offered. One hand braced against the dashboard as the truck bounced over the rugged terrain. "Elaine Winters. Thank you for stopping." "Jack Thornton," he replied curtly, focus fixed on navigating the increasingly smoke-obscured road. "Ranch is about 3 miles west. Should be safe there if we make it before this thing jumps the fire break." If Elaine questioned, anxiety edging her voice, Jack's expression remained impassive. Winds shifting, not in our favor. As if on cue, a powerful gust sent embers sailing overhead, igniting the canopy of trees to their right. Jack swore under his breath and veered left onto an even narrower track, the truck's suspension groaning in protest. "Shortcut," he explained tersely. "Might buy us some time." Elaine gripped the dashboard tighter as they plunged deeper into the forest, the smoke growing so thick she could barely see the trees flashing past on either side. Jack drove with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of this land, navigating by instinct when visibility failed. The truck's headlights cut weak paths through the thickening smoke, their beams reflecting back like they were driving through dense fog. The air inside the cab grew hotter despite the air conditioning running at maximum, and the smell of smoke penetrated every breath despite the closed windows. Jack's focus never wavered from the treacherous path ahead, but his mind cataloged the worsening conditions with professional concern. The fire was behaving erratically, driven by gusty winds and feeding on tinder-dry vegetation. If they couldn't reach the relative safety of the cleared land around his ranch house soon, they'd be in serious trouble. A loud crack overhead gave them only seconds of warning before a burning branch crashed onto the truck's hood, sending sparks across the windshield. Jack swerved instinctively, the truck's rear end fishtailing on the loose soil before he regained control. "We need to move faster," he muttered, more to himself than to Elaine. "The forest is burning all around us," she countered, panic rising in her voice. "Trust me, I've seen worse," Jack replied, downshifting as they approached a steep incline. The old truck's engine roared as he pushed it harder than it was meant to go, the speedometer climbing despite the treacherous conditions. Elaine's hands clenched the seat beneath her, knuckles white with tension. Her filmmaker's instinct to document warred with the primal fear of their situation. In her decades-long career, she'd faced danger before war zones, hurricanes, even a tsunami, but always with some measure of control, some distance between herself and the immediate threat. This was different. This was visceral, immediate peril with no guarantee of escape. "The highway," she managed to ask between shallow breaths. "How far?" Jack shook his head, never taking his eyes from the road. "Highway's east. Fire's between us and it. Ranch is our best bet. Cleared land. Fire breaks. Concrete structures." They crested the hill to confront a horrifying sight, and the valley below had become a sea of flames, cutting off their path forward. Jack slammed on the brakes, the truck sliding to a halt at the edge of what had become a fire tornado swirling through the drought-stricken trees. "We can't go this way," Elaine stated the obvious, her documentary filmmaker's eye automatically assessing the apocalyptic scene, even as fear knotted her stomach. The fire tornado twisted with hypnotic, terrible beauty, drawing burning debris into its vortex and hurling it hundreds of feet into the air. The heat radiating from it was palpable even through the truck's windshield. Elaine had filmed the aftermath of such phenomena, but had never witnessed one in person. The awesome, destructive power left her momentarily speechless. Jack scanned their surroundings, calculating options with the focus of someone accustomed to life or death decisions. "There's an old fire service road about half a mile back. It'll take us down to the creek bed, if we can reach the water." He didn't finish the thought, already reversing the truck with practiced precision. Elaine held her breath as the vehicle's tires came within inches of the eroding hillside edge, certain they would plummet down the slope at any moment. Jack, however, executed the maneuver flawlessly, getting them turned around and headed back down the hill. "How do you know these roads so well?" Elaine asked, partly to distract herself from their dire situation. "Used to be a hotshot crew leader," Jack answered, his attention never leaving the road. "Fought fires all over the western states for 15 years before taking over my dad's ranch." This explained his calm in the face of the inferno surrounding them. Elaine felt marginally reassured if anyone could navigate them out of this disaster. It would be someone with Jack's experience. "Were you with Forestry Service or—" "Smoke jumpers first," Jack cut in, braking hard to avoid a burning branch that crashed down before them. "Then hotshot crew. Then went private with a contract outfit that specialized in the worst blazes." His tone discouraged further questions, focused entirely on the immediate challenge of survival. The reassurance was short-lived. As they approached the turnoff for the fire service road, a wall of flames erupted directly in their path. Jack braked hard, throwing his arm instinctively across Elaine's chest to prevent her from hitting the dashboard. "We're cut off," he stated grimly, studying the advancing fire with the analytical eye of a veteran. "No way through there now." Elaine stared at the hypnotic dance of the flames, momentarily transfixed by their terrible beauty, exactly the kind of footage that would make her documentary compelling. The professional part of her brain noted lighting conditions and framing even as survival instincts screamed for escape. "What's our alternative?" she managed to ask, snapping herself back to the immediate danger. Jack put the truck in reverse again. "One more option. Hold on." He backed up until finding a narrow gap between trees. then surprised Elaine by accelerating directly into the forest where no road existed. The truck bounced violently over exposed roots and rocks, branches scraping along its sides with a sound like fingernails on chalkboard. "Are you insane?" Elaine shouted, clinging to whatever handholds she could find. "Creek's about quarter-mile this direction," Jack explained, gritting his teeth as the truck lurched over a fallen log. "No trail, but the ground's mostly clear." "Mostly?" she echoed incredulously as they narrowly missed a massive pine trunk. The truck's heavy-duty suspension, designed for rugged ranch work, was being tested beyond its limits. Each impact jarred Elaine's teeth and sent pain shooting through her spine. Jack handled the vehicle with the desperate skill of someone who knew failure meant death, anticipating obstacles and adjusting their course with split-second decisions. The smoke had grown so thick that Jack was navigating almost blindly, relying on memory and instinct. Elaine covered her mouth and nose with her bandana, struggling to breathe in the suffocating air. The temperature inside the truck cab had risen to unbearable levels despite the air conditioning running at maximum. A deer burst from the underbrush ahead of them, its eyes wild with panic, followed by smaller creatures fleeing the approaching inferno. Jack swerved to avoid the terrified animal, nearly clipping a tree in the process. "Wildlife, no," he commented grimly. "Fire's gaining on us." Without warning, a massive burning branch crashed through the rear window, showering them with glass and embers. Elaine cried out, brushing sparks from her hair and clothes. Jack maintained his focus on their path, though a muscle in his jaw twitched with tension. "Almost there," he encouraged, voice rough from smoke inhalation. Elaine felt the heat intensifying, burning through her clothes wherever embers had landed. The air became nearly unbreathable, each inhalation scorching her lungs. Her eyes watered profusely, blurring her vision further. Through it all, Jack maintained his intense concentration, hands steady on the wheel despite everything. Through the windshield, Elaine caught glimpses of what appeared to be a clearing ahead. Hope surged briefly until she realized what waited wasn't safety, but a new danger, a steep ravine dropping away before them. "Jack," she warned. "I see it," he confirmed, steering toward what appeared to be a precarious path down the embankment. "Creek's at the bottom. It's our only shot." The truck began its descent, tires struggling for purchase on the loose soil and rocks. Jack navigated with extraordinary skill, using the engine's compression to control their speed on the steep grade. For a moment, Elaine dared to hope they might make it. Halfway down, disaster struck. The ground beneath the right front tire gave way completely, causing the vehicle to tilt at a sickening angle. "We're sliding!" Elaine gasped as the truck began to slip sideways down the ravine. Jack fought the steering wheel, but physics had taken control. The truck's weight pulled it inexorably toward the steepest part of the slope. "Out now," Jack commanded, already pushing his door open. "Jump clear." Elaine didn't hesitate, grabbing her bag and throwing herself from the vehicle just as it broke free completely. She tumbled painfully down the slope, rocks and branches tearing at her clothes and skin. When she finally came to a stop, the air had been knocked from her lungs, and she lay gasping like a landed fish. Above her, Jack's truck completed its descent in a more direct fashion, rolling twice before coming to rest on its roof at the edge of a shallow stream bed. The gas tank, mercifully, didn't ignite, though smoke poured from the crumpled engine compartment. Pain radiated through Elaine's body from a dozen minor injuries, but nothing seemed broken. She forced herself to her hands and knees, then to her feet, scanning desperately for her companion. "Jack," Elaine called, struggling to her feet. Terror gripped her when no answer came. "Jack!" She half ran, half slid down the remaining distance to the overturned vehicle. Dropping to her knees, she peered inside the shattered driver's side window. Jack hung suspended by his seatbelt, blood running from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes were open, and he was moving. "I'm okay," he grunted, reaching for the belt release. "Stand back." Elaine retreated a few steps as Jack freed himself, dropping awkwardly onto the truck's ceiling before crawling through the window opening. He emerged grimacing, one hand pressed to his ribs, blood matting his gray hair. "Your truck," Elaine said helplessly, watching as smoke continued to billow from the engine. Jack surveyed the wreckage, and something flickered across his features, not just pain, but a deeper anguish that vanished almost instantly behind his stoic mask. The truck had clearly meant more to him than mere transportation. "Just a truck," he replied pragmatically, though pain flashed across his features that seemed to have nothing to do with his physical injuries. He reached back inside to grab a battered rucksack and what appeared to be a rifle case. "Creek's our priority now." Elaine noticed him glance once more at the overturned vehicle, his expression unreadable, before turning resolutely away. Later, she would understand the significance of that moment. The truck had been his father's, one of the last tangible connections to his family's past. The shallow stream offered their best protection from the advancing fire. Jack led them downstream, away from the wrecked truck, moving with purpose despite his obvious injuries. Elaine followed, wincing at her own collection of cuts and bruises from the tumble down the ravine. "The water's so low," she observed worriedly, noting that what should have been a flowing creek was reduced to a series of stagnant pools barely ankle deep. "Drought," Jack confirmed grimly. "Still wet enough to keep us alive if we're lucky. Fire will jump the creek, but we might find a pocket where we can ride it out." They sloshed through tepid water for several minutes before Jack stopped at a section where the ravine widened into a small clearing. A massive fallen tree created a natural barrier on one side, while a rock formation offered some shelter on the other. The creek pooled slightly deeper here, perhaps calf-high at the center. "This is it," Jack decided, dropping his gear on a sandy patch. "Best we're going to find." Elaine glanced up at the rim of the ravine, where the fire had already arrived, consuming trees at a terrifying rate. Smoke billowed overhead, turning day to apocalyptic twilight. Will it be enough? The roar of the approaching fire had become deafening, drowning out all other sounds of the forest. The air temperature rose noticeably with each passing minute, and breathing became increasingly difficult despite their relatively protected position. Instead of answering directly, Jack opened his rucksack and extracted what appeared to be an emergency fire shelter, the last resort protection used by wildland firefighters when escape was impossible. He handed it to Elaine. "You know how to deploy one of these?" he asked. She shook her head. "It's simple. When I give the word, unzip it completely, shake it open, and lie face down with it covering you completely. Keep your face pressed to the ground, no matter what happens. Do not look up or expose any part of your body until I tell you it's safe." "What about you?" Elaine asked, noticing he'd only given her one shelter. Jack reached back into the bag and extracted a second shelter, older and more worn than hers. "Always keep one in my emergency kit. Habit from the old days." As they prepared their position, wetting bandanas to cover their faces and soaking their outer clothing in the creek water, Elaine couldn't help but study her unlikely rescuer. Despite his injuries and their dire situation, Jack maintained a stoic calm that spoke of someone who'd faced death before and made peace with its possibility. His movements were efficient, practiced the muscle memory of someone who'd prepared for fire emergencies countless times. Yet there was something in his eyes when he glanced at the approaching flames, a shadow that suggested not just professional respect for the danger, but a deeper, more personal relationship with fire's destructive power. "Why did you stop?" she asked suddenly. "On the road back there. You could have kept driving, saved yourself." Jack looked up from checking his fire shelter, seeming genuinely puzzled by the question. "Someone needed help." "You risked your life." A shadow crossed his weathered face. "Wouldn't be the first time. Besides, leaving someone to die isn't something I could live with." Something in his tone suggested personal history beyond professional duty, perhaps connected to the burn scars she'd glimpsed on his forearms when he rolled up his sleeves. Before Elaine could inquire further, The fire announced its imminent arrival. Before Elaine could respond, a roaring sound overhead announced the fire's arrival at the ravine edge. Superheated air rushed down toward them, carrying embers and ash in a suffocating wave. "Now," Jack commanded, already deploying his own shelter. "Get down and stay down." Elaine followed his instructions, fumbling slightly with the unfamiliar equipment before managing to cover herself completely with the reflective material. Through the thin shelter, the world transformed into hellish orange light and unbearable heat. The roar of the approaching fire became deafening, like a freight train bearing down on their position. Lying face down in the damp creek bed, Elaine felt terror unlike anything she'd experienced in decades of documentary filmmaking in crisis zones. This was primal, beyond rational thought, the fear of burning alive that lived in humanity's collective nightmare. The shelter, essentially a large foil blanket designed to reflect radiant heat, felt impossibly fragile against the inferno raging overhead. Elaine pressed herself into the damp sand, trying to make herself as small as possible, fighting the instinct to flee that screamed through every nerve in her body. "Stay calm," Jack's voice came from nearby, somehow audible despite the inferno's roar. "Breathe slowly. It'll pass over us." Elaine tried to follow his advice, focusing on controlling her breathing as the temperature rose to almost unbearable levels, even beneath the protective shelter. The air grew so hot it scorched her lungs, each breath a painful reminder of how thin the barrier was between life and death. Through the translucent material of the shelter, the world outside had transformed into apocalyptic orange-red, punctuated by the black silhouettes of falling debris. The roar grew so loud it became a physical pressure against her eardrums. Occasionally, the sharp crack of exploding trees penetrated even that overwhelming sound. An eternity seemed to pass as the firestorm raged overhead. Elaine lost track of time, existing only in a moment-to-moment struggle to endure. Throughout the ordeal, she remained acutely aware of Jack's presence nearby, a stranger who'd risked everything to save her, now facing death alongside her. Her mind wandered to her parents, to how they'd described the terror of their own wildfire experience 2 decades earlier. At the time, she'd thought she understood. Now, she recognized her comprehension had been academic. Theoretical, nothing like this visceral reality where each breath might be your last. If they survived, she promised herself, her documentary would capture this truth, not just the statistics and expert interviews and policy debates, but the raw, primal experience of being trapped in nature's most terrifying manifestation. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the roaring began to diminish. The hellish orange glow penetrating her shelter faded to a duller red, then to murky darkness. The suffocating heat remained, but the immediate sense of imminent death receded. "Stay put," Jack's voice cautioned when Elaine instinctively moved to peek outside. Secondary burns can be just as dangerous. They remained under their shelters for what felt like another hour before Jack finally gave the all-clear. "Should be safe now. Come out slowly." Elaine emerged cautiously, shocked by the transformed landscape. What had been a forested ravine was now a blackened, smoking wasteland. Fallen trees smoldered around them, and the air remained thick with ash and smoke. Their small haven around the creek bed stood as an island of relative safety in a sea of destruction. Jack looked worse for wear, his face streaked with soot and blood, but he was methodically repacking his emergency gear with the efficiency of someone who'd done it many times before. When he straightened, Elaine noticed him wince and press a hand to his side again. "You're hurt," she observed. "Cracked a rib or two in the crash," he admitted. "Nothing life-threatening." Elaine approached him, professional instincts taking over. "Let me see. I've had first aid training." Jack hesitated, then relented, lifting his shirt to reveal an angry bruise spreading across his ribcage. As he did so, Elaine noticed something else extensive scarring across his torso, the kind that could only come from severe burns long since healed. The scarring covered much of his left side, disappearing around his back, evidence of an injury far more severe than he'd let on. Professional curiosity warred with basic human decency in Elaine's mind. As a documentarian, she wanted to know the story behind those scars. As a human being who owed Jack her life, she recognized his right to privacy. "Old injury," Jack said curtly, noticing her gaze and dropping his shirt back into place before she could examine his ribs properly. "We need to move. Fire's passed over us, but there's no guarantee it won't circle back if the wind shifts." "Where can we go?" Elaine asked, surveying the smoking ruins surrounding them. "Your truck is destroyed. Ranch is about 2 miles west," Jack replied, shouldering his pack. "Creek leads right to it. It's our best option. Will your property be safe?" The main house is surrounded by fire breaks and cleared land. Standard precaution out here. His tone didn't invite further questions. They set off along the creek bed, picking their way through smoking debris and fallen trees. The going was slow, both of them nursing injuries from their ordeal. Elaine found herself studying Jack as they walked the careful way he moved despite obvious pain, the alertness with which he scanned their surroundings, the quiet competence in every decision. He was unlike anyone she'd encountered in her documentary subjects before, a man of few words but decisive action. His gray hair and weathered face spoke of a life lived outdoors, under harsh conditions. The lines around his eyes suggested he'd once smiled easily, though he showed little evidence of that now. There was a gravity to him, a weight that hinted at experiences beyond Elaine's understanding. As a filmmaker, she recognized a compelling subject when she met one. "Those scars," she ventured after they'd walked in silence for nearly half an hour. "They're burn scars, aren't they?" Jack's stride didn't falter, but his jaw tightened visibly. "Yeah, firefighting." He nodded once, eyes remaining fixed on the path ahead. "Carson Valley blaze, 03. Got caught when the wind shifted. Fire shelter failed." Elaine felt a chill despite the lingering heat around them. Fire shelters like the ones they just used were last resort protection, not guarantees of survival. For one to fail meant, "You're lucky to be alive," she said softly. Jack's expression remained unreadable. 17 other guys in my crew weren't so lucky." The weight of those words hung between them as they continued their trek through the scorched landscape. Elaine had interviewed enough survivors of trauma to recognize the burden of guilt Jack carried, the special hell reserved for those who lived when others didn't. "Is that why you left firefighting?" she asked after another stretch of silence. Jack navigated around a still smoldering log before answering. "Spent 2 years in burn units and rehab. By the time I was cleared for duty, my father's health was failing. Came back to help with the ranch, never left." His matter-of-fact delivery couldn't disguise the significance of the choice. Elaine sensed there was more to the story, perhaps a reluctance to face fire again after such trauma, or a sense of obligation to family legacy. Whatever the reason, Jack Thornton had exchanged one demanding life for another, trading the adrenaline of disaster response for the steady, grinding challenge of maintaining a family ranch against increasing odds. After another hour of difficult hiking, the ravine began to widen, the blackened forest gradually giving way to more open terrain. Ahead, Elaine could make out fenced fields and, in the distance, what appeared to be ranch buildings. "Your property?" she asked. Jack nodded, visibly relieved to see his home still standing. "Looks like the fire breaks held. Main blaze passed north of the house." As they approached the ranch, Elaine took in the modest but well-maintained single-story home, a large barn, and various outbuildings. A windmill turned lazily beside what appeared to be a stock pond, though its water level was alarmingly low. The entire property spoke of care, taken despite limited resources. Patches on the barn roof, mended fences, machinery that had clearly been repaired many times rather than replaced. It wasn't what Elaine had expected. In her experience, ranches in this region were either corporate operations with state-of-the-art equipment or romanticized hobby ranches owned by wealthy urbanites seeking a taste of Western lifestyle. Jack's place was neither. It was a working ranch maintained by someone who lived and breathed its daily reality, who knew every fence post and water line intimately. A border collie came bounding toward them, barking enthusiastically before skidding to a halt. confused by their smoke-blackened appearance and unfamiliar scent. "It's okay, Max," Jack reassured the dog, who approached cautiously to sniff his master before accepting that this sooty stranger was indeed his owner. The dog's enthusiastic greeting transformed Jack momentarily. His stern expression softened, and his hand gently ruffled the animal's fur with genuine affection. It was the first unguarded moment Elaine had witnessed, a glimpse of the man beneath the stoic exterior. "He didn't evacuate with you?" Elaine asked, concerned. "Wasn't time to evacuate anything," Jack replied. "When I spotted the fire, I went to check the boundaries. Found you instead." The implication wasn't lost on Elaine. Jack had abandoned his evacuation plans to save her, potentially risking his home and livelihood in the process. The weight of that sacrifice settled uncomfortably on her shoulders as they approached the house. The interior of Jack's home reflected the man himself: practical, unpretentious, and resilient. Wood floors had been worn smooth by generations of boots. The furniture was sturdy and functional rather than decorative. What caught Elaine's attention, however, were the photographs covering one wall of the living room: Jack in firefighter gear with his crew, Jack in military uniform, Jack with a beautiful dark-haired woman and a young girl who shared her features. In one photo, a younger Jack stood proudly beside his father in front of the very truck they just lost in the ravine. Father and son shared the same weather-beaten features and steady gaze, though the elder Thornton's face bore the additional lines of another generation's struggles with this demanding land. "Bathroom's down the hall," Jack directed, setting down his gear. "You can clean up. I'll find you some clothes that might fit. Those are ruined." Elaine glanced down at her once expensive outdoor wear, now torn, smoke-damaged, and stained beyond salvation. "Thank you." In the simple bathroom, Elaine confronted her reflection with a shock. Soot blackened her face except for clean tracks where sweat or tears had cut through the grime. Her short, silver-streaked hair was singed at the ends, and an angry scrape ran along her jawline. She looked like one of the disaster victims she'd filmed countless times as shell-shock survivors in the aftermath of catastrophe. The woman staring back at her bore little resemblance to the polished media professional who'd left Los Angeles 4 days earlier. That woman had observed disaster. This one had lived it. The experience had stripped away the professional distance she typically maintained between herself and her subjects. For better or worse, she was now part of the story she'd come to document. The shower's hot water was gloriously restorative, despite its faintly metallic smell. Elaine scrubbed away ash and dried blood, watching the water run black, then gray, then finally clear. By the time she emerged, wrapped in a towel, she felt human again, though every muscle protested from the day's ordeal. True to his word, Jack had left a stack of clothing outside the bathroom door, a flannel shirt that had clearly belonged to a woman, jeans with a belt to cinch the larger waistband, and thick socks. Everything was clean, though well worn. Elaine dressed gratefully, then followed the sound of movement to the kitchen. Jack had also showered and changed, his gray hair still damp, a white bandage covering the gash on his forehead. He moved stiffly as he filled a kettle at the sink, the cracked ribs clearly paining him. "Let me help," Elaine offered, stepping forward. Jack's instinct to refuse assistance was visible in his expression, but practicality won out. He nodded toward a cabinet. "Coffee's in there. Mugs to the right." They worked in companionable silence, the routine task of making coffee creating a moment of normalcy in a day of extremes. Jack moved with the careful precision of someone managing pain, but he refused to acknowledge his injuries or accept further help. Pride or stoicism. Elaine couldn't yet tell which dominated his character. The kitchen, like the rest of the house, spoke of practical functionality rather than style. The appliances were dated but well-maintained, the countertops worn but scrubbed clean. A calendar on the wall was marked with notations about cattle rotations, feed deliveries, and maintenance schedules, the rhythmic heartbeat of ranch life. When they finally sat at the kitchen table, steaming mugs before them, the reality of their situation seemed to settle around them like the ash outside. "Thank you," Elaine said simply, "for saving my life." Jack acknowledged her words with a slight nod, his gaze fixed on some middle distance. Phone lines are down, and cell service is spotty at best during normal times. Radio says the fires jumped the highway to the west. We're effectively cut off until they get it contained. So I'm stranded here, Elaine concluded. For a day or two at least, Jack confirmed. Spare bedrooms made up. It's not fancy, but it's clean. Elaine studied him over the rim of her coffee mug. You don't seem bothered by having an unexpected house guest during an emergency. Something that might have been amusement flickered briefly in Jack's eyes. Not my first rodeo. Ms. Winters, living out here. You learn to adapt. Elaine, please, she corrected. And you've had strangers you rescued from wildfires stay with you before. No, Jack admitted. But I've had stranded travelers, lost hikers, and once a family of 4 whose RV broke down during a blizzard. Pine Ridge isn't exactly on the main tourist route. People who end up here usually need help of some kind. And you always provide it, Elaine observed. Not really a question. Jack shrugged as if the answer were obvious. That's how it works out here. Today me, tomorrow you. The simple philosophy struck Elaine as profound in its practicality. In her world of competitive media and cutthroat film industry politics, such straightforward reciprocity was rarely encountered. She found herself wondering what Jack would make of Los Angeles, with its carefully cultivated images and strategic relationships. The thought of this plain-spoken rancher navigating a Hollywood premiere or network executive meeting almost made her smile. He would see through the pretense immediately, just as he seemed to assess everything with that direct, uncompromising gaze. So, Jack said after a moment, changing the subject, what brings a city woman to Backroads, Montana during fire season? You're not dressed like a tourist, and that camera you're carrying isn't amateur equipment. Elaine considered how much to reveal. Her instinct as a filmmaker was always to remain somewhat neutral, to observe rather than participate. But after what they just survived together, standard professional boundaries seemed inadequate. I'm a documentary filmmaker, she explained. I'm researching a project about rural communities dealing with increasingly severe wildfires due to climate change. The human stories behind the headlines. Jack's expression remained neutral, but Elaine sensed a subtle withdrawal. So this was a research trip. Preliminary location scouting, she confirmed. I like to get a feel for places before bringing in a full crew. Well, you certainly got more material than you bargained for, Jack observed dryly, rising from the table with a barely concealed wince. I need to check on the stock. Help yourself to whatever you need. As he moved toward the door, Elaine noticed the local newspaper on the counter, its headline declaring, Horizon Agricultural Corporation expands holdings in Pine Ridge region. The subheading caught her professional interest immediately. Local farmers express concerns as corporate giant buys 6th property. This year? Is this happening a lot around here? She asked, gesturing toward the paper. Big agricultural companies buying up local farms. Jack paused at the door, his expression darkening. More than just happening, it's being engineered. Horizon creates the conditions that force small operations to sell, then swoops in with cash offers when banks foreclose. Creates the conditions, Elaine echoed, her investigative instincts awakening. How? They acquired water rights upstream 3 years ago. Since then, we've seen our irrigation allotments cut by 40%. They claim it's drought-related conservation, but their own operations never seem to suffer shortages. Jack's tone remained measured, but the bitterness beneath was unmistakable. They've bought out the grain elevator in town, raised handling fees for non-Horizon farmers. They've got representatives on the county agricultural board, making life difficult for independents. As he spoke, his shoulders squared almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift from exhausted survivor to embattled defender. This was clearly a subject that ignited passion beneath his controlled exterior. That sounds like a systematic campaign, Elaine observed, mentally shifting the focus of her potential documentary. Climate change remained the backdrop, but corporate exploitation of that crisis offered a compelling narrative angle. It's business, Jack said flatly. Nothing personal about it, just numbers on a spreadsheet to them. But it is personal to you, Elaine pressed gently. This is your home. Jack's weathered face revealed nothing, but his knuckles whitened where he gripped the doorframe. Been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built this house with timber he cut himself. My father expanded the operation from 50 head of cattle to 300 in his lifetime. A shadow passed across his features. I'm down to 75 now. Might not make it through another year. The admission clearly cost him, pride warring with the reality of his situation. Before Elaine could respond, Jack straightened his shoulders and continued toward the door. Need to check the herd, he repeated. Make yourself at home. Left alone in the suddenly quiet house, Elaine felt the professional detachment she usually maintained crumbling. She'd come to Montana seeking stories of climate resilience, expecting to document pragmatic adaptations and community responses. Instead, she'd stumbled into something more complex, a David and Goliath battle, playing out in slow motion across America's heartland, with lives and legacies hanging in the balance. And Jack Thornton, the taciturn rancher who'd risked everything to save a stranger, was on the front lines of that battle, fighting with dwindling resources against forces both natural and man-made. The story unfolding before her was far more nuanced than the climate change narrative she'd originally envisioned. Here was the intersection of environmental crisis, corporate opportunism, and personal resilience, all embodied in one man's struggle to preserve not just a business, but a heritage and a way of life. Elaine glanced at her camera, miraculously intact despite their harrowing escape. Perhaps there was a reason beyond mere chance that had brought her to Pine Ridge, to this particular ranch, to Jack Thornton. As a documentarian, she'd learned to recognize when seemingly random events revealed a deeper narrative thread. This felt like one of those moments. Elaine found herself drawn to the wall of photographs in the living room, studying the visual history of Jack's life. The military photos showed a younger, less weathered version of the man, his expression serious even then. The firefighting crew pictures captured camaraderie and purpose. Jack surrounded by men in similar gear, often grinning amid the grime of a job well done. One photo in particular caught her attention, Jack receiving some kind of commendation. The caption beneath reading, "Thornton receives Medal of Valor for Carson Valley Rescue Efforts, 2003. The same fire that had scarred him physically had apparently marked him as a hero, though his earlier comments suggested he viewed the event very differently. It was the family photos that held her attention longest. Jack with the dark-haired woman, his wife. Elaine presumed their body language speaking of deep connection. Jack teaching a young girl to ride a horse, his face transformed by fatherly pride. A more recent photo showed the same girl, now a young woman in a white coat, standing beside Jack at what appeared to be a university ceremony. His daughter's in medical school. The voice startled Elaine. She turned to find an elderly man standing in the doorway, hat in hand, concern etched in the deep lines of his sun-weathered face. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't hear you come in." "Nah, door was open," the man explained. "I'm Frank Miller, neighbor from down the road. Saw the fire jump the ridge and came to check on Jack." His shrewd eyes assessed Elaine's borrowed clothing and the professional camera she'd set on the coffee table. "You're not from around here." "Elaine Winters," she introduced herself. "Jack rescued me when my car was trapped by the fire. I'm a documentary filmmaker." Recognition flickered in Frank's eyes. "Thought you looked familiar. You did that series on the Dust Bowl Farms a few years back." Elaine nodded, surprised and somewhat pleased to be recognized in such a remote location. "Yes, American Dust was one of my projects." "Good work," Frank said simply. "Showed things like they really were, not how city folks imagine rural life to be." He gestured toward the back of the house. "Jack out with the cattle." "Yes, he went to check on them after the fire." Frank nodded as if this were exactly what he'd expected. "That's Jack." House could be burning down around him, and he'd make sure the animals were safe first. He hesitated, then added, "Sarah was the same way. His wife, she was a veterinarian, Passed 5 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry to hear that, Elaine said sincerely, the information adding context to the sadness she'd sensed beneath Jack's stoic exterior. Toughest thing I ever saw, Frank continued, moving further into the room. Jack nursing her through those last months while keeping the ranch going. Never complained once. Sarah made him promise to keep the place running, to make sure Rachel could finish her education. His gaze drifted to the photographs. That girl's the spitting image of her mother. Smart as a whip, too. Frank moved to the window, gazing out at the smoke-hazed landscape. Jack's had a rough go since then. Sarah was the optimist of the pair. She'd find the silver lining in a tornado. Without her, he shook his head. And now this business with Horizon pushing everyone to sell? He mentioned they've been acquiring local properties. Elaine probed gently. Frank turned back to her, eyes narrowing slightly. That for your documentary, I haven't decided what my documentary will focus on yet, Elaine answered truthfully. I came to research wildfire impacts, but I'm learning there's a more complex story here. The old man studied her for a long moment, seemingly weighing her sincerity. Jack won't talk about it much, but he's 3 months behind on his loan payments. Banks owned by the same investment group that backs Horizon. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Frank's implication was clear. The corporate takeover of local agriculture wasn't just aggressive business. It bordered on predatory practice. The filmmaker in Elaine immediately recognized the narrative potential, while the human being responded to the injustice of the situation. How many local ranchers and farmers have sold to Horizon? She asked. 8 in the past year, Frank replied grimly. Most were families that had worked this land for generations. The Miller place, that's us, and the Thornton Ranch are the last significant holdouts in this valley. What makes your properties different? Why haven't you sold? Frank's weathered face creased in a humorless smile. Stubbornness, mostly, and in Jack's case, a promise to Sarah. She loved this land almost more than he does. Before Elaine could respond, the back door opened, and Jack entered, surprise registering briefly on his face at finding his neighbor in his living room. Frank, he acknowledged. Everything okay at your place? Fire missed us completely, Frank confirmed. Jumped right over the hollow and kept going north. Your herd, all accounted for, Jack reported. Had to move them to the south pasture away from the smoke. But they're fine. He glanced between Frank and Elaine, clearly wondering what they'd been discussing in his absence. Your guest was just telling me about her documentary work, Frank supplied. Recognized her from that farming series, the one Mary made me watch on PBS. Jack's expression revealed nothing, but Elaine sensed his reassessment of her. Being known for a respectful portrayal of rural life clearly carried weight in this community. I should get back, Frank said, settling his hat on his thinning white hair. Mary's worried sick with all this smoke. Just wanted to make sure you weren't in trouble. He paused at the door. Meeting at the Grange Hall tomorrow night. Emergency Planning Committee. Might want to bring your guest, give her a real look at how small towns handle big problems. The suggestion wasn't subtle. Frank clearly saw potential value in having a documentary filmmaker witness the community's response to both the immediate fire crisis and the longer-term threat posed by corporate takeover. His shrewd eyes held Elaine's for a meaningful moment before he nodded a farewell and departed. After Frank departed, a silence settled between Jack and Elaine, pregnant with unasked questions. Jack broke it first, his tone carefully neutral. You didn't mention you were a well-known filmmaker. You didn't ask for my resume, Elaine countered gently. Would it have made a difference in that burning forest? The corner of Jack's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Guess not. For what it's worth, Elaine added, I try to portray the communities I document with honesty and respect. I'm not interested in creating poverty porn or rural stereotypes. Too many documentaries about rural America fell into predictable narratives, either romanticizing a disappearing way of life or focusing exclusively on poverty and social problems. Elaine had always sought the more complex truth that lay between these extremes, The resilience and adaptation that characterize communities like Pine Ridge. Jack considered this, then nodded once acceptance, if not full trust. Frank mentioned the Grange Hall meeting tomorrow. You interested? Very, Elaine confirmed. If you're willing to take me. Nothing better to do while we wait for the roads to clear? Jack said pragmatically, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of bringing an outsider, especially one with a camera, into community business. Elaine decided to address his concern directly. I won't film without permission. Jack, that's not how I work. Right now, I'm just trying to understand what's happening here. The fires, the situation with Horizon, how communities like Pine Ridge are adapting to changing conditions. Jack studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes assessing in a way that made Elaine feel as though she were being measured against some internal standard. Whatever he saw must have been sufficient because he nodded again, more definitively this time. Fair enough, he conceded. Town could use some outside attention on what's happening here. Might not be a bad thing to have someone document the truth before there's nothing left to save. The resignation in his voice troubled Elaine deeply. This wasn't just a man facing the potential loss of property. It was someone watching the erasure of a way of life, a heritage, and a community. The filmmaker in her recognized the powerful story unfolding before her, while the human being responded to the quiet dignity with which Jack faced that potential loss. Sometime, she said carefully, the right documentation at the right time can make a difference. I can't promise anything, but I can promise to tell whatever story I find here truthfully. Jack didn't respond directly, but some of the tension seemed to leave his shoulders. He moved to the kitchen, opening the refrigerator. Dinner's going to be simple. Power's been fluctuating with the fire crews working on the lines. Simple is fine, Elaine assured him, recognizing the subject change for what it was not a rejection of her offer, but a man accustomed to actions rather than words. As they worked together preparing a meal from Jack's well-stocked pantry, clearly maintained with rural power outages in mind, Elaine found herself studying her unlikely host with growing interest. Here was a man who embodied resilience in its purest form, facing disasters both natural and man-made with the same quiet determination. His story, and that of his community, deserved telling regardless of what direction her documentary ultimately took. Through the kitchen window, the smoke-tinged sunset painted the landscape in surreal hues of orange and purple. In the distance, the glow of the wildfire remained visible, a reminder that the danger hadn't passed completely. Jack glanced occasionally in that direction, his expression unreadable, but his awareness constant. Elaine wondered what it must be like to live with that vigilance, to know that your livelihood and legacy could be destroyed by a shift in the wind or a corporate boardroom decision. Such precarity would break many people. Yet Jack continued his methodical food preparation, discussing practical matters like water conservation and fire preparation with the matter-of-factness of someone who'd long ago accepted uncertainty as life's only constant. Have you always wanted to be a rancher? Elaine asked as they sat down to a simple but hearty meal of venison stew that Jack had defrosted from his freezer. The question seemed to surprise him. Never thought much about wanting or not wanting. It's just what we do. Thorntons have worked this land since my grandfather homesteaded it in 1948. But you were in the military, and then firefighting, Elaine pointed out. You chose other paths first. Jack considered this while chewing thoughtfully. Dad encouraged us to see something of the world before settling here. Said a man should choose the ranch, not just inherit it by default. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Of course, he assumed we'd all come back eventually. Thornton blood runs with sawdust and cattle manure. He used to say, we, Elaine inquired. You have siblings. Had a brother, Jack replied, his expression closing slightly. Michael, Air Force pilot, killed in Afghanistan in '08. I'm sorry, Elaine said sincerely, recognizing another layer of loss in Jack's life. Jack acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod, then continued. Mike was the one who was supposed to take over the ranch eventually. He had the real knack for it, could look at a piece of land and tell you exactly what it needed. Could doctor a sick calf better than most vets? His voice remained even, but Elaine detected the subtle shift in tense, the present tense admiration for his brother's talents, contrasted with the past tense reality of his death. So when he died, I came home, Jack confirmed simply. Dad was getting older, needed the help. By then, I'd had enough of watching things burn. His hand unconsciously touched his side where the burn scars lay hidden beneath his shirt. Elaine wanted to ask about the Carson Valley fire, about the Medal of Valor photograph, about the 17 colleagues who hadn't survived, but she recognized the boundaries Jack had established in their conversation. Some stories needed time and trust before they could be shared. And Rachel, she asked instead, gesturing toward the photographs, your daughter always wanted to be a doctor. This topic visibly lightened Jack's demeanor. From the time she was 8, Sarah, my wife, was a vet, and Rachel would help out sometimes with the smaller animals. Had a natural touch. We figured she'd follow her mother's path, but she decided humans needed her more. Pride softened the lines around his eyes. She's in her 3rd year at the University of Washington, top of her class. You must be very proud of her. She's the best of both of us, Jack said simply. Got Sarah's compassion and my stubbornness? Dangerous combination. For the first time, Elaine heard genuine warmth in Jack's voice, a glimpse of the man he might have been before grief and struggle had hardened his exterior. It confirmed her earlier impression beneath the stoic surface lay deeper currents of feeling, carefully controlled but powerful nonetheless. The evening deepened around the isolated ranch house, the orange glow of distant flames visible through the windows as a reminder of the precarious boundary between safety and destruction. Inside, 2 strangers brought together by catastrophe shared a simple meal, unaware that their chance encounter would ultimately change not just their own lives, but the fate of an entire community fighting for its survival against forces that seemed as unstoppable as the wildfire still raging beyond the horizon. As Elaine helped clear the dishes after dinner, the day's events finally caught up with her. Exhaustion hit like a physical weight, making her movements clumsy and her thoughts sluggish. Jack noticed immediately. Spare bedrooms ready. First door on the left down the hall. Bathroom stocked with whatever you might need. Thank you, Elaine said, grateful for the reprieve. For everything today, I'm not sure I've properly expressed how much. Jack cut her off with a small shake of his head. No need. Get some rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure out next steps. The practical dismissal of her gratitude was oddly comforting, no social niceties required, just the straightforward acknowledgement of human needs. In Jack's world, actions clearly spoke louder than words, and he'd already demonstrated through his actions what kind of man he was. The spare bedroom proved to be simply furnished, but comfortable, with a handmade quilt on the bed and curtains that matched its pattern. Family photographs adorned the walls here too, suggesting this might have been Rachel's room before she left for college. A bookshelf held an eclectic mix of medical textbooks, classic literature, and what appeared to be journals, the intellectual evolution of a curious mind. As Elaine settled into the unexpectedly comfortable bed, her filmmaker's mind continued to process the day's experiences, cataloging potential narrative threads and visual motifs. The contrast between destruction and preservation, between corporate calculation and human connection, between natural disaster and man-made crisis, all converging in this remote Montana valley. Her last conscious thought before exhaustion claimed her was that she'd come to Pine Ridge seeking a story about climate change and community resilience. Instead, she might have found something far more personal and profound, a story about what we choose to save when faced with overwhelming loss, and who we become in the crucible of that choice. Outside, the wildfire continued its relentless advance across the drought-stricken landscape, while inside, seeds of a different kind of transformation had been planted in the unlikely connection between a struggling rancher and the documentary filmmaker he'd pulled from the flames. The scars of fire reshaped both land and soul. Where flames once raged across Pine Ridge, green shoots now push through blackened earth, nature's quiet testament to survival against impossible odds. Jack Thornton stands at his fence line, watching cattle graze where smoke once choked the air. The deed to his ranch rests safely in his pocket, no longer threatened by corporate letterhead or drought. Not all victories come without cost. His father's truck lies rusted in a ravine, his body bears new scars, and the community around him has forever changed, some neighbors gone, others transformed by their collective stand against forces both natural and man-made. Elaine's documentary captured more than just a community's fight against corporate predators or climate disaster. Her camera found something rarer, the dignity in stubborn resistance, the beauty in refusing to surrender what matters most. In Jack, she discovered a truth worth preserving, that some roots run too deep to be washed away by either fire or fortune. Perhaps that's what remains when the smoke finally clears, not just the things we managed to save, but the discovery of what was worth fighting for all along: the land, the legacy, the promise of something authentic in a world that values neither history nor heart. Some fires destroy everything they touch. Others forge something that can never be broken.